notes today are on the events leading to the French Revolution. All right. Okay, so first of all, the Louis we're talking about is Louis the 16th, if you remember. He was the grandson of Louis the 15th. Remember that Louis the 15th lived so long, he was such an old man, that his son died while he was still in power, and it skipped a generation and went to his grandson. Remember the guy that was like the womanizer that had that lady with the bright dresses on his arm? That's Louis the 15th, okay? He was the oldest surviving son of 8 children. And remember the rule of the heir and the spare? The oldest son always gets to reign unless there's something wrong. Although he did have younger brothers, and that became an issue in this case. He became Dauphin at the age of 11. To remember, what does Dauphin mean? You heard it in the movie. Or what's that? Son of France. In other words, he's the next leader of France, the prince of France, the next to be king. Good. He loved locks and hunting, if you remember. That's why he took those dogs out in the movie when he was hunting. And locks, yes. Seriously, he had a collection of keys and locks. Kind of a weird hobby, but so be it. To each their own. He was matched to Marie Antoinette of Austria, who then became Marie Antoinette in French. They were married when he was 15 years old, and she was only 14 when they got married. So that would mean you'd be married now, or younger, ladies. Can you imagine? And the only thing she knew about him was this picture you see right here on the slide. And it was a tiny little picture that she carried, remember? In the carriage, that's all she knew about this guy. And yet she had the fate of the nation in her hands. Now, if you look at a lot of pictures of Marie Antoinette, she tends to look pretty old. In fact, she looks kind of like a grandma in this picture. But believe it or not, she is 12 years old in this photo, or this painting, I should say. Because remember, in that day, it was very popular to powder your hair, either gray or white, or even pink. There were a few of those in the movie. So a lot of times, she's much younger than she appears in her pictures. She was the last of 15 children. Remember, we studied her mother in our Enlightenment leaders, right? Okay. She was the baby of the family. And she was paired to Louis to keep good relations between Austria and France. And understand how much pressure that is. I mean, she is basically protecting the safety of Austria by marrying that man. Because if he doesn't like her, they very well could invade and attack Austria. So lots of pressure on her. In order to be married, she paid a dowry of 200,000 crowns, or her family did. They exchanged portraits that you saw when she was in the carriage in the movie. And they also exchanged rings that represented the two royal families as a sign that they would be married. And if you remember the handover ceremony, she had to leave everything behind, from her clothing to her dog to her friends, because France saw themselves a little bit above everybody else, and she was supposed to start over. Everything is left behind. You also remember the blessing on the marriage bed on the wedding night, right? But what happened on the wedding night? Nothing. Wasn't that what they said in the movie? Nothing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So let's talk about the children of this family. You saw that she had terrible pressure to conceive. And we have the letters between her and her mother, the Queen of Austria. Her mother was saying she wasn't being nice enough or pretty enough, and that's why her husband wasn't having relations with her, and that she'd better do it, or he would dissolve the marriage, and Austria would be in trouble. The other pressure that she had was that he had a younger brother, and the brother was already having babies. And if they have babies and Marie and Louis don't, they could actually pass them up and choose the younger brother for the next king, because it's all about having a male heir. So she had that problem as well. In fact, there were very public announcements about the fact that they were not having sex. There was a pamphlet that went around that said, can the king do it or can't he? all kinds of rumors that he was gay, that she was a witch with a B, and so he didn't like her, that they were physically incapable of having sex, all kinds of stuff. But then you remember that Marie's brother, future king of Austria, Joseph, comes to visit, right? Goes for a walk with his brother-in-law out in the zoo in the backyard. And what was the problem? Yeah, he didn't know how to have sex. And so he was afraid that if he tried, he might do something wrong and be embarrassed. So instead of being embarrassed, he just didn't do anything. So once he got advice from an older man about what to do, voila, they had babies. Now, if you look at this painting, we mentioned this in the movie. What did we see happen in that painting? Yeah, one of the children got removed from this painting. There used to be one in the bassinet here, and the baby died. And so they actually just painted them out of the picture. This painting is still up at Versailles Palace today. You can see it. It is beautiful. It's about as tall as this ceiling here in our room and about as wide from the board to my corner there. So it's a nice, beautiful painting. Now, this is the weird part. And if you can find the answer, please let me know. Now, supposedly they had 2 girls and 2 boys. But somewhere between what I've read and what I've seen, I cannot figure out where the other child went to. I'm assuming they had another child die. I know that the one died, but by the time that they are executed, there is only 1 boy and 1 girl. So somewhere between here and their execution, they lose another child. And I'm not sure exactly what happened. I've tried to find it out and I can't find out. So could be a stillborn. Sure. That could be. And it was very common to lose children in that day, you know, so. Okay. Now, you also saw in the movie that they have a tradition of observing labor. Girls, can you imagine how embarrassing that would be? Poor lady with her legs apart, popping out this kid, and you have like 50 people in the room watching. Oh my gosh, embarrassing. But the question is why? Okay, this is why. Because you very well as a queen could put some stuffing underneath your dress and come out and say, my people, look at my beautiful baby. And it might be someone else's baby. Could they lie? Of course they could. So this is a tradition in France because they want to make sure that it is from the actual bloodline of the queen to make sure that she actually gave that child childbirth. So that's why. Kind of weird. So the question is, why did they hate Marie? Lots of reasons. First of all, you saw that she was the outsider. They made fun of her because she was from Austria, of course. The other thing that caused a lot of doubt is she went to her little cottage quite often. It was a little cottage called Petit Trianon. And her husband built it for her. The reason? She wanted to raise her own children. If you remember the scene after she has her first child, the nannies want to take away her baby right away. They called them wet nurses because they actually breastfed her children. They would find someone that had other children that still had breast milk, and they would actually feed her children. And then they would take them away to some castle, remember, and train them to be the next king and queen. They would only bring them back when they were teens, when they mattered, right? We talked about that. Well, she said, I want to raise my own kids. I want to be with them myself. So going to the cottage was the only way that she could do that because Versailles would have required her to follow the rules. Now, when she did that, though, it made things really bad for her. Because remember how they were gossiping about her at the table? Well, imagine how bad it would be if you weren't there. Be even worse, right? So it did. It got really bad. They started spreading rumors around the country that she was a traitor. She was giving information to the enemy. They said that she was having an affair on the king, all kinds of stuff. Most of it probably not true, but we don't know for sure. That's why in the movie, they portray that she has an affair with that Swedish guy, but there is no evidence at all. I need you to be clear about this. There's no evidence that she had an affair. They did it in the movie to represent what the people in France thought. We do know that the guy was a real person. He was a friend of the king's, but there's no evidence that they actually had an affair. Okay? So they're gossiping about her because she's leaving Versailles. She also knew how to shop. Boy, oh boy, did you see all those clothes and the shoes and the wigs? Oh my gosh, so awesome. But lots of money. They had lots of parties that cost thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, probably millions of dollars today, right? So she knew how to spend. But on the other hand, I mean, that's what they expect of you at Versailles, right? That's the way you live there. The other thing you have to remember is Versailles is 15 miles away from Paris. That would be like living in Brandon here and never ever going to Sioux Falls to see what's happening in South Dakota, okay? They never went to Versailles other than to the opera. And who did they run into then? Rich people, right? Because only the rich went to the opera. So I don't think they really had any clue how bad things were, like throughout the rest of the country, until it was too late. Because they were partying and having fun at Versailles. The other thing that gives her a really bad name is the most famous quote by Marie Antoinette. The story goes that someone said to her, "Your people are starving. You need to get them bread." And that she stuck her nose up and said, "Let them eat cake." The truth is she probably did not say that, but it was printed in the paper. And of course, if it's in the paper, it's fairly accurate, right? Isn't everything in the newspaper right? Oh, you have doubt? You're kidding me. Same thing here, but it goes down in history under her name forever. So they don't like her very much for that either. Now, at this time in France, here's where we get into some new things. France was split into what we call 3 estates. We might see them as classes, but the numbers don't jive, okay? The first estate was called the clergy. And this group are your cardinals, your bishops, and your priests. Remember, they were Catholic for the most part. So these are your religious people. If you look at our population of France, they represented 0.5% of the population total. They're in purple, okay? The second estate are your nobles. These are your rich people, the people that are related to the king, anybody who has lots of money and lots of power. They would be government workers, military people, people who like are in the court system. Any of those people would be nobles, and they're very wealthy. They're represented in green down here, and they are 1.5% of the total population. So again, a very small group. The third estate, which is in red, is everybody else. That includes your peasants, your serfs, the poor people, your shopkeepers. It also includes your bourgeoisie, one of your vocab words. Your bourgeoisie means your middle class. Now, I think probably a lot of us in this room would be middle class. Probably, okay? Teacher, definitely middle class, okay? But notice their middle class was a little different at this time in France. Middle class would include people who own their own business. How many of you have a dad or mom that owns their own business? Raise your hand. Okay, you would have been middle class then, okay? Now, some might be today, but some might not, depending on how successful, right? Bankers, how many of you have a banker for a mom or dad? They were middle class then. Okay, how many of you have a lawyer for a mom or dad? Okay, tends to be more of an upper class thing in our society, right? They were middle class then. How about any parents who are doctors or lawyers or doctors? Got some doctors. Now, obviously, we see doctors as pretty wealthy. They get paid more than teachers anyway, right? But in this day, they were middle class. Now, notice that they represent 98% of the population of France. So let's see why they're so upset. First of all, let's look at the land ownership of France. The clergy in purple, 0.5%, they own 10% of all the land in France. So a little group owns quite a bit. The second group, the nobles, 1.5%, they own a fourth of all of France's land. That's a lot for a very small group. And then 98% of the people, they own 65% of the land. But even that didn't make people too upset because that's the way it's always been. They don't know anything different. Here's what made them angry, right here. What's the problem? What about the taxes? Yep. The only people that were taxed were the third estate. That means that your richest people didn't pay 1 cent in taxes. These are the people that can't even put food on the table, and yet you're expected to pay those taxes. Now that bothered them in the first place, but it gets worse. Because here's what happened next. The French budget went in the hole. It collapsed. Why did it collapse? A couple of reasons. There's three main reasons. First of all, the spending of the royalty on trees for the backyard at Versailles, on parties, on clothing, on wigs, all that stuff. And yes, they did spend a lot, but that wasn't the only reason. And a lot of people blamed Marie for this because they saw the wigs, the dresses, blah, blah, blah. Okay? The second big problem that caused our collapse of our budget was about 3 years of really bad harvests. Now, I don't know if any of you are farm people out here, but you know that 3 years of bad crops, what that would do to a family, right? I mean, that just destroys you. And that's what happened. They had no wheat, which meant they had no bread, and that meant people were starving. So that caused a problem. The thing that they spent the most on, though, was this right here. On us, the American Revolution. The French were basically financing our revolution over here. Well, think about it. The people that did the American Revolution, we were rebels, right? So our government surely wasn't going to help us because they were loyal to the king over in England, right? So we are totally reliant on other people to finance us or just try to survive. So they spent a lot of money trying to help us. Well, here's the thing. So they thought, well, the budget is in the hole. Let's just raise taxes. Well, you can't even put food on the table for your children. How are you going to pay more taxes, right? The people went nuts. Are you kidding me? We can't even afford what you tax us already. That was the final straw. We cannot pay any more taxes. So here's what happened. This is the first event leading us to the French Revolution. A few people representing the Third Estate met with the king, and they said, King, we got to talk about some problems because this isn't working, especially the taxation thing. This is not working. We need to write a constitution that will give us some rights. He says, sure, sounds like a plan. How about you come back in 3 days? We'll write it out. We'll all be good. Well, 3 days later, the people showed up and the king did not. He locked the doors at Versailles, would not let them in, and wouldn't even recognize them. So those people said, I'll get you, Mr. King. We're going to write it anyway. So they went to a nearby tennis court, and they wrote the first Constitution of France. That's the name, the tennis court oath, right? Because it was written in a tennis court by the people, of the people, for the people. What do you notice about this tennis court? It's indoors. In this day, tennis was more like racquetball, kind of. It was indoors. You could play off the walls, stuff like that. So just a little aside there for you. The second major event leading to the French Revolution was the storming of the Bastille. You see a picture of it here. This was a really old fortress that was used for two things. It was used as a prison and an armory. Who can tell me what's an armory? Yes, weapon storage. It's kind of important. So here's what happens. Of course, the Third Estate are starving and they're rebelling. Well, the king is taking his soldiers and he's going to put down this rebellion. They need weapons. They have to defend themselves. So they attack the Bastille to get to the guns so that they can defend themselves. Well, once they get inside the Bastille, unfortunately, there were no guns. They were all gone. They were so furious that they took this building and burned it to the ground, tore it down brick by brick. In fact, there is nothing left today. There's like a modern building on top of where it was. There's nothing left. Not only that, they freed all the prisoners and they beheaded the prison warden. Now, why is this event important? It is at this point that Paris has fallen to the rebels. The king and queen no longer control the largest city in their country. They're in trouble, and they know it. If you remember this moment in the movie, they were playing croquet, and they come and tell them, Madame, they've stormed the Bastille. That's that moment. They know that they can no longer go back to Paris. They're in trouble. The next time period is called the Great Fear. And it's called the Great Fear actually because both sides were afraid at this point. The king is afraid, and he should be, because he's hearing about all these rebellions in Paris, right? The Bastille's been stormed. People are furious. He's heard about the tennis court oath. Not only that, but his own troops were starting to switch sides. So he couldn't even trust some of his own soldiers. So he is afraid. But the peasants are also afraid, and they should be, because they know that the king has contacted his allies in other countries around them in Europe and said, please send help. Send your soldiers so we can put down this rebellion. And they were on their way. So they're worried, and they should be. It just takes them a while to get here. Now, to any of you, raise your hand if you recognize this painting. Any of you seen this before? It's a really famous painting, probably the most famous painting of the French Revolution. And I believe people have used it for a lot of different things. Like, I think Coldplay has used this as a cover for one of their DVDs. We'll study it more in detail, but in general, I just want you to know, this is a famous painting from the French Revolution. Notice who are our main characters in this painting? Who are the heroes? Peasants. What else do you notice about them? Up front, what do you guys notice about the two people that are the main people? No, they're French. What are they? Women and children. This revolution was not fought just by men. It was fought by anybody that could hold a weapon. And that included ladies, included you, it included children, anybody that could fight fought in the French Revolution. You'll notice that they're carrying the French flag, and this red in this flag represents all of the blood that was shed in the French Revolution. Okay? All right. Now, if you remember, the first document that they wrote was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It's like our Declaration of Independence. It was inspired by our Declaration, our Constitution, and also the English Bill of Rights. They looked at all of those. So we've already taken some notes on this, but I'm going to give you more today. Okay? All right. First of all, it said all men are free and equal. You've heard that before. And we're guaranteed they have to protect our property or we can overthrow them. Remember that? Okay. But there's other things in here. It also said that public office positions were based on talent, not on that you were a noble or you knew the king or your name. So it's based on talent. It also said, and now you know why, no group was exempt from taxes. Because after seeing those pie graphs, you understand why they were upset. Only the third estate was paying taxes. It gave them freedom of speech and press. So notice they're using some of our Constitution ideas here instead of our Declaration ideas. And remember, this is the document where Olympia de Gouges, fighting for women's rights, took this document and put woman in instead of man. Remember that? This is that document. All right, the next major event is the Bread March. Land number 4. Is that right? Something like that. Okay, you saw the Bread March in the movie. Louis refused to recognize the Declaration of the Rights of Man. He said, I will not allow that. So a whole bunch of people marched 15 miles, mostly barefoot, and mostly women from Paris all the way to Versailles, because most of the men were actually working. So the women actually marched. They armed themselves with anything they could get their hands on, axes, broomsticks, pitchforks, anything. And they demanded bread, and they wanted to kill the king and queen, right? Now, there are some things you didn't see in the movie that were happening. They decided not to show. They did have a meeting between the leaders of the Bread March and the king and queen. And they said, we're starving, we're furious, we have no bread. And the king and queen said, well, we've got a lot of flour here. We'll give you flour. So they fill up a huge wagon, and they actually bring the flour to Paris for the people so they could eat. Well, the king and queen went with that wagon, and you can probably guess the rest. That's the last time that they will ever be at Versailles, because they are then taken prisoner. They'll never return again. So once they're brought to Paris, they are put in prison. Now, I've already showed you, you saw where she escaped. We don't need to do that. I've told you about the secret doors here, so we're going to go on to this. Let's go on to the execution. Now, the king and queen were charged with treason. What is treason? What's that? Yes, they are charged with death for doing what? What is treason? Betraying your country. And when you think about it, remember we talked about the government's number one responsibility is to protect our property, right? The people are starving. That is our property, isn't it? Was the government doing their job? No. So therefore, they weren't really being loyal to their country. They weren't watching out for you, which should be their number one job. You can see why they put that in their declaration. Okay? So this is the thing that I find interesting. It's not like they took the royal family out and killed them right away. They actually sat in prison for 4 years, because at the point that they are captive, we now have the French Revolution. There is no government, and there's chaos. There's 4 groups fighting for control of France, and they're killing each other, and it is a mess. So they don't know what to do with the king and queen, because there's no government. Well, they finally got a group of representatives together who voted, and they decided to kill the king and queen. So 4 years later, they killed King Louis I in January. They did use the guillotine because it is more humane. Yep, it was a new invention. It was more humane. I've told you this before, but one of the things Marie writes about while she's in prison is that she could hear her children crying, and they were all in separate cells, and she couldn't go to them. In fact, her son is dying, and she can't go and be with him and hold him. And that was the hardest thing for her during this time. Marie was very proud to the end as she walked to her death in the scaffolding. She was beheaded in October. So notice quite a ways later. She was 38 years old when she was killed. So to give you an idea, that is younger than me. Okay? So it's not like she was a really old lady when she died. She was actually pretty young. Her son, very sad, died of tuberculosis in the prison cell because it's wet and cold and damp, and so he died of the conditions and died in prison by himself. The weird thing is they left the daughter alone, which is not typical. The daughter survived to be an old lady. She lived to be a duchess in France and died of natural causes. So the rest of the family, that's what happened. And now we are in full swing of the French Revolution, and we are in a mess in France at this point. Yeah. You know what? I think Caitlin makes a really good point that women had no rights in France at this point. Anyway, I mean, even when Napoleon took over, women had no rights. So why should they worry about a woman? Good point. I like that. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, they didn't worry about a little kid, an age limit, for example. So, yeah.